that we have with us today, Steve Scheinbaum and Joseph Lustberg, and I will let them give an introduction, and we'll take it from there.
Go ahead, Steve. Age before beauty.
Okay, that's for sure. James, thanks a lot. Appreciate it. And deBanked and everyone out there, thanks for attending and having us. Quick background, I founded BizFi, ran that from 2000, initially Merchant Cash Capital, then BizFi, ran that from 2005 till 2017, excuse me. And then in 2018, I started up Circadian Funding, which I run now. We're a broker. We participate some, focusing, I'd say 2/3 of our business is in the unsecured market. The other third is in all asset-backed type products, whether it's real estate, equipment, inventory, AR, purchase orders, things of that nature. And really glad to be here, be part of it.
My name is Joe Lustberg. I'm the CEO of Upwise Capital. Upwise Capital is a full-service funding marketplace, just like Lendio or any of the other big players in the space. The only difference between us and everybody out there is that we do specialize in the cannabis space, right? We have a focus in cannabis real estate financing. We also have a variety of different products available in the cannabis space, and we have a lot of experience funding larger transactions in the marijuana-related business industry.
All right, excellent. So we'll start with some questions. First question I have here is, what was the industry's capital access like before the shutdowns? And what has it been like during the shutdowns? Obviously, we're all in the midst of a pandemic still, especially here in New York, where most of us and most of the industry stems from. And we are starting to see these guidelines loosen. We're starting to come out of our houses and back into the offices a bit. But the industry's capital was certainly a certain way prior to COVID, and throughout COVID and up until now has been completely different. So what is the difference that you guys are seeing in your businesses?
Joe, I'll take first stab at it. Fine. Pre-COVID, I look at capital for in the cannabis space as broken down into the equity or capital markets and the debt markets. Long before the pandemic, the equity markets had sort of bottomed out on the cannabis space. Valuations had plummeted, and when valuations are really high or really low, one of the parties is not happy with the valuations and really doesn't want to do the trade, so they turn more to debt. The debt in the cannabis industry, there's equipment, there's inventory, there's land, there's raw materials, and then there's cash flow that can all be leveraged. And I know Joe will touch a bit on that, but it's a good thing because there are lots of avenues and assets to secure financing with. I think I've seen a rising interest on behalf of all the lenders in the various categories within the space to put more money to work. Since COVID, cannabis, like tobacco, like liquor, it is essential. It has grown. The sales are literally going up through the roof, and we see more and more interest in it. There are some technicalities that we'll get to later about banking, but the appetite for debt and the debt that is available is definitely growing from my perspective.
Yeah, and Joe, just before Joe answers, I just wanted to touch on what you just mentioned, Steve, and something that sparked that caught my attention at least. You know, a few years ago, buying or going to buy marijuana or cannabis was illegal any state you went to in the U.S.
Yep.
Now we're in a pandemic. Every business across the country has to shut down unless you're deemed essential. And now the marijuana cannabis industry falls under this essential industry from only a few years ago, where we were,
right,
locked up if you were.
Yeah, it's fascinating.
Cannabis.
Yeah, all the cash advance lenders in our space are starting to really fund the cannabis industry, at least most of them. And these cannabis files that we keep seeing are larger files, right? And going on the pandemic topic, right? Really what we saw, the difference between prior to COVID and during the peak COVID months was that, you know, cannabis dispensaries were required to do deliveries in order to get an approval, right? So if they weren't delivering during the peak COVID months, right, they weren't able to get a cash advance. We're really, you know, more versed in the debt space rather than the equity space, right? We don't, you know, mess with equity deals. It's not something that we're looking to do, right? But we work with a lot of different large ISOs and large, you know, accountants, and you'd be surprised on how these top 10 accounting firms are all involved in the cannabis space. And not only are they involved, but they have international teams that are strictly dedicated to the cannabis industry, right? So the cannabis industry is becoming more prevalent, right? And it's definitely being more accepted by the masses. Every time you swipe through Instagram, right, you can see a new celebrity promoting some type of CBD product, right? You go to CVS, you can see a hemp lotion in CVS, right? Marijuana is being accepted by the masses, and, you know, everybody just needs to get on board.
Very, very interesting. Next question. Is the cannabis industry underserved? And can they access money from a bank, or is this going to be the domain of non-banks?
Let's start in reverse order. It's presently the domain of non-banks or state chartered banks, as Joe was just mentioning, and James did. You know, cannabis is not legalized on a federal level. As a result, banks that are transacting business across state lines and throughout the whole country really cannot fund these businesses, and they can barely even give them, let them have bank accounts. So as a result, the people that are playing the supply of lenders and capital providers is greatly limited to that space. In fact, and one of the things that makes it even harder for cannabis businesses is cannabis, they often have to do so much of their business in cash, and so many of us out there know that lenders are looking at bank statements, and a lot of these guys don't have banks, don't have bank accounts. What I've seen, and I know Joe and James have also seen recently, is I have seen several principals of cannabis businesses going into mainstream banks, and they are starting cash management consulting businesses, and that business is signing up the business that's owned by their shareholders and other cannabis businesses as their customers, and can make deposits. And there are contracts and contractual provisions saying that that management company doesn't have access, doesn't own the funds in there. And as a result,
are they using? Sorry, Steve. Are they using that firm, you know, kind of as a shelter to get the banking?
That's right. So the cash management, company. So Joe, if you and I were partners in a cash management, in a cannabis business, we would go open up a cash management company, and we would manage the money for our cannabis business. And now that cash management company can go open up bank accounts at a Wells Fargo, at a B of A, all over the country. And now, and I've seen that in the last 3 or 4 transactions that we've done, and it's helped tremendously. I think that as states and the federal government need more revenue, many more states and the federal government will likely, because of the pandemic, will see an enhanced or an increased speed of approval for cannabis to be legalized, which will help that much more, because then the financing community there'll be so many more players from the financing community that have the ability to call on and service these cannabis businesses, you know, and it's wholly underserved. I mean, if you look at from the vast distribution centers and all the equipment and all the agricultural products and the machinery and fumigation equipment, all that stuff is just going to become more and more prolific as time goes on.
I do agree with that as well. Joe, this next question's for you. Is cannabis on par with liquor in terms of demand from consumption by the general population?
In my opinion, yes. The cannabis industry is constantly growing, and it's going to surpass liquor, right? It's actually a statistic that March 2020, during the peak months of COVID, was the highest consumption month of marijuana in the history of the United States, right? Currently, we have 35 states that have some sort of medical marijuana, right? Governor Cuomo recently just said that by 2020, New York is going to be fully, not just medical, but recreational. Right. I believe that the cannabis industry will surpass it just because there's so many different industries within the cannabis industry. Right. Just to give you an example, is me and my team, we went to the Cannabis Expo last year at the Javits Center. The most popular booth at that expo was a CBD infused liquor. Right. Everybody was trying to go to that booth to try and taste the liquor and see what kind of effects it had on you. Right. It's just things. Because of things like that, because you can put marijuana into any type of product, you know, it is definitely going to surpass the liquor industry, in my opinion.
Sure. I mean, you can get it in candy now. You can get it in foods, and like you said, you can infuse it in
everything.
Yeah. Dangerous and convenient, right? Next question.
Joe, can I ask you a question? Can I ask Joe a question as
Sure.
a follow-up? As a follow-up to that, hey Joe, when do you think that as federal legislation or legalization happens, and we're about to, and then you can have sort of regional distribution hubs, right? And it'll be that much easier for people to get it. So someone who is on the border of one state can just travel 5 miles over the border of another state and go get it. I mean, I imagine you think that would increase consumption and demand for the product as well?
Drastically, right? As soon as it becomes federally legal, that's when I think really our opportunity as, you know, cash advance brokers and alternative financing lenders, that's when we're gonna, you know, lose our chance to keep funding these businesses, right? That's when the big banks will get involved. You know, like I said earlier, the large top 10 accounting firms are all involved in this space already, right? So once it does become federally legal, that's when, you know, we won't be able to fund these deals anymore, or it'll be more difficult because they'll have more access to capital.
Right. Or will it almost act as the rest of our industry does today, where, you know, there's restaurants that there's plenty of restaurants that can go to Wells Fargo or Chase and get capital for their businesses. But then there's plenty of them that come to us to
Correct. So they just need to qualify, right? They need to be showing consistent growth year over year, right? They need to be showing profitability. They need to have a bank account for at least 2 years, right? Those are all things to get a traditional term loan, right? So either way, it'll be difficult for marijuana businesses to get financing, and they will have to turn to us. But the big players in the game, you know, the publicly traded companies and all these companies that are traded on the Canadian stock market, you know, they'll be going directly to the banks.
Yeah, agreed.
It's interesting because, like, you look at. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Go ahead, Steve.
No, it's interesting because if you look at what happens every time, like after the pandemic now, or after 2008 and 9, or after Hurricane Sandy, or whatever, the best customers, banks slow down and tighten, and the best customers that normally get bank financing can't, so they come down into our space. Then when everything resumes sort of normalcy, the MCA world and the unsecured world is left with the non-bankable companies. Right now, I think right now we in our space all have access to the best companies in the cannabis space. But once there's legalization, it'll be like everything else. We'll get the non-bank, we'll get those businesses that don't qualify for the traditional bank financing, just like we've seen in every space.
Yep, correct. Joe, this next one's for you as well. What is the underwriting process like for the industry?
In my experience, the underwriting process for cannabis files is a little more intensive, right? You're not just collecting 3 months of bank statements and an application to get an approval, right? From our experience here at Upwise Capital, we collect the full file, right? We collect financials, a pro forma, projections, real estate schedule, information on any equipment, the licenses, personal financial statements, an executive summary, or a pitch deck if they have it. But we specialize in collateralized deals, so we're doing a lot of appraisals. And what we've learned is that when you do a cannabis appraisal, it's not your typical appraisal, right? They're going to come in and they're going to value the whole business, right? All your licenses, the greenhouse, everything except for the actual plant, right? And those appraisals, from my experience, they cost a lot of money, right? Last week, we had a $1.2 million offer for a collateralized deal out. It was an $8,000 appraisal, right? It's something where we cover the cost for the client because he had a term sheet signed, but you know, those type of larger files, right, do require so much more in-depth underwriting.
Makes sense. Next question: what are the potential commissions for the cannabis industry, and are they similar commissions to the rest, you know, other industries that we are financing today?
Yeah, I think what we've seen so far, and we'll hear what Joe has to say, but we've seen them be very similar to the other industries. If we're dealing with an MCA file and we're getting someone unsecured debt, it's like any other large unsecured. It's like any other large unsecured file. You know, if you're doing a $400,000 or $500,000, $600,000 advance, you're not going to make 9 points, 10 points. You're probably making 4 points or 5 points. Correct. In the real estate world, if you're securing it by real estate, you're going to have your 2 points. If there's AR, if it's a grower who's distributing to big companies and you're doing AR inventory, you can probably make anywhere from 10 to 15 to maybe 20% of the interest revenue that the lender's making. So we don't see, we see the disparity in the type of financing that people get. You know, secured versus unsecured, but we have not seen a big disparity between a cannabis file and a restaurant file. You know.
Correct. Simple answer is the points are the same depending on what product you're selling them. Yeah.
Sounds good. How did the leap of cannabis start from illegal to now considered essential, like we were just talking about before? So the state legal roadmap, where it stands in a shutdown, farmers versus medical versus recreational/retail.
Go ahead, Joe.
All right. So as the states become more and more legalized and they, you know, start to open up, there's actually 14 states on the ballot this year, right, to become fully recreational, right? If that happens, that means 47 out of 50 states in the United States will have some sort of medical marijuana program in place. Right. Before the shutdown, you know, the industry, it was very difficult for them to get financing. After the shutdown, it's still difficult for them to get financing. Right. Really, you can't get banking in the cannabis industry unless if you're touching the plant, most of them. Right. If you actually physically touch the plant, then it's very difficult for you to get banking. Right. The difference really between farmers, medical, and recreational, you know, for us personally, you know, we do a lot of collateralized deals, right? So if we're doing a farm deal or a cultivation deal in a rural area, right, especially during COVID, right, it was very difficult for us to be able to get an appraiser to that location, right? It was very difficult for us to overcome, you know, certain things like that during COVID. Now, a couple months after it, right, things are starting to change and get a little bit back to normal. I think that everybody listening here is seeing it this week and the past week that, you know, cash advances are starting to come back a little bit more, right? But you have to diversify in these times, right? And that's why we focus in the cannabis industry. I believe it was the guy John Henry said earlier, he's like, niches get you riches, right? So this is the niche industry for anybody who's looking to do larger files or thinks that they can handle, you know, funding some larger deals.
Yeah, I would echo that. And as we were saying, I think more and more we're going to see more and more legalization because state and federal governments are going to need revenue to dig themselves out of this pandemic. And it's a really hot product, and they can tax it. And I don't think the consumers are going to stop purchasing it because there's an extra 8%, you know, consumption tax.
For instance,
I will say, for those of you that want to handle the files, like, and as Joe mentioned, I'm sorry.
Oh, sorry. I said Heather Francis said earlier that we should all be underwriting our customers and the customers, right? And it's just proven by straight data that dispensary customers are going to dispensaries or getting their marijuana delivered to them more than ever during this pandemic, right? Everybody's so uncertain. Everybody's panicking. They don't know if they can go near somebody or touch anybody. Smoking weed calms you down, right? So the consumption is up right now, right? So that's a big part of, where the industry is going. And I think that this pandemic will help to make it fully legal or federally legal.
Well, and just to touch on what Steve was saying before, and I saw that myself as we were starting to crawl out of this pandemic, you're seeing states talking about this, just like Cuomo last week, a few weeks ago mentioned it, and it's all stemming from, a lot of it, I should say, is stemming from COVID and that money that they need to make up from it.
One point that Joe mentioned earlier in terms of handling large files is, I tell you, as a breath of fresh air, the cannabis business is so capital intense that I don't know the last time I did a cannabis deal where there was not a real strong base of equity holders or institutional money backing them. And as a result, you're dealing with a much more professional organization than a guy who owns a little pizza shop, generally. And on the ISO side, on the salesperson side, you have to be equipped to handle that, right? Because Joe, James, and I were talking before that at times like this, we almost have to sell ourselves. You have to realize that you're going to be your first call, the CEO and board members of a cannabis business that has raised 30, 40, $50 million of equity. They're expecting to deal with someone that understands how to move from one asset class and one product to the other, and they're sophisticated files. And for those of you that like to work on those files, it's really a breath of fresh air. No pun intended.
It's very tough to get a lot of points out of these deals, right? Because like you said, you're dealing with a much more sophisticated buyer who's raised family and friends money, or done it in the beginning when they started their company.
Yep, big difference. Next question: what type of products are available to the cannabis industry?
So I'll take this one, Steve. There's a bunch of products that are available here at Upwise Capital. We offer a lot, not just cash advances, even though cash advances are our bread and butter, right? There's real estate financing, collateralized loans, you have equipment financing, you have sale leasebacks, you have purchase order financing, acquisition loans. Sometimes, we can get some private investors to lend against crop and inventory. We also offer credit card processing solutions for the CBD industry, right? It's a great way for brokers to bring in residual income, right? And then people can't find banking solutions, right? So we have banks that we work with where we can actually get them a bank account so that we can fund them. And then there's also cashless ATM solutions, right? If you go to a dispensary to purchase product, right, you're going to the ATM machine, it's going to spit out a ticket on exactly what your purchase amount is. Take that ticket to the counter, give it to the bud tender, right, and they give you your product, right? Also, here at Upwise, we are announcing a new product. We have a collateralized product. It's a 24-month term. Usually comes in anywhere between 18 to 24%. It comes in, before COVID, it was coming in around 24 months. Now it's coming in between 12 to 18 months, right? It's an interest-only payment with a balloon payment at the end. And for that product, we do need first lien position, and we need the business to be generating revenue. If it's a revenue-generating business, which most of these cultivation facilities, dispensaries, grow operations, they're all revenue-generating businesses that qualify for this product. It really is almost like a hybrid to the cash advance, but it's a secured loan.
Let's see. How can a marijuana business become bankable?
Just things we touched on earlier, right? You have to have a bank account first and foremost, right? Second is all the partners have to have good credit, just like any other term loan. You have to show consistent growth year over year and show that you're profitable for at least 2 years, right? Also, taking the next step and creating a pitch deck or getting audited financials, right? And then also having a pro forma or some type of projections done so that we could see the potential growth in the future.
So all that, Joe, will help you towards getting a bank. Is that becoming bankable for financing or to get a bank account? just so people
So,
are understanding.
becoming bankable, that will make you a bankable loan, right? We work with many large banks. One of them out here in Long Island is BNB.
Yep.
Right? BNB is offering term loans to marijuana related businesses. They can't be touching the plant, right? But if you bank with BNB for at least 2 years, then they'll offer you a term loan, right? We touched on it earlier, that small federal credit unions, within your state, if you're banking with that credit union for a certain amount of time, right? Over time, they build up the relationship with you. They understand how your business operates. Then they'll offer you a term loan, right? Eventually, once it becomes federally legal, term loans will be offered to cannabis-based businesses.
Makes sense. I know that there are a few questions coming in from some of the panelists. I'm sorry, from some of the attendees, but if we have time at the end, we will answer those. So you guys can keep putting the questions in, and if we have time, we will. We are getting a little bit down on the time, but we'll try to get to them. Is it too late for you to cash in on the cannabis industry? And that's to anybody.
I would say
I would
no.
say undoubtedly not. We have to be in the we have to be in the third or fourth inning of this 9 inning game. Bunch of states left have to continue to legalize it. Federal legalization will be coming, and that will just open up a whole bunch of more opportunity, for everyone in attendance. That's just my view, but I think we're still pretty early, long way to go.
So that kind of plays to almost what my last question, which was, what's next for this industry, for the marijuana industry, and where do you gentlemen each see it kind of going?
The marijuana industry is going to keep growing, right? It's one of the largest exploding industries out there. Just to give you some perspective on how big it can really be, right? Beats sold for $3.2 million to Apple. Everybody knows the Beats deal. It's all over the news, right? But nobody knows that Canopy Growth, as soon as it becomes federally legal, has the right to purchase acreage holdings for $3.4 billion, right? So it just shows you a kind of comparison on how large the cannabis industry will be once it becomes federally legal.
Steve?
Yeah, I would share that view.
Yep.
Not much to add for the sake of time. I agree with everything Joe said.
And then we had a question come in from one of the attendees. What are some of the qualifications for your products?
I'm assuming that's to me.
Mm-hmm.
It really depends, right? It depends what product you're talking about, right? If you're talking about greenhouse financing, right, they have to have a greenhouse and they have to be generating good revenue, right? If you're talking about a cash advance, just like any other cash advance, right? We need at least 6 months time in business, and you need good growth and good revenue coming in, right? But collateralized loans, we need first lien position, right? So the borrower has to have enough equity, or own enough equity for us to be able to take first lien position. Right, we won't go in second position on any collateralized deal, especially marijuana business. Right, it's a high risk industry, and it's not something we're willing to do.
Yeah. I would say we can definitely get second positions on real estate for sure. In the business, probably 75-80% LTV. We've put out some really competitive.
Just understand, Steve, that our
second
product
position.
is on our own balance sheet, right? So it's not like I'm going to go in second position.
Yep. Yeah, no, understood. I'm just speaking generally speaking. Generally speaking, your product sounds great. I'll be sending you some deals.
Let's go, Steve. I'm ready for you.
All
right, gentlemen. I think that about wraps it up. Unless anybody has anything else to add, I appreciate the time today, and look forward to speaking to you both.
All right, great. It was a pleasure. Thank you guys very much.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.
Thanks to all. Stay safe and healthy.